Luke, I am really excited because we've brought our viewers outside to the outdoor Granite Ridge Testing Center. And when we talk about building a solid investment, we've got to start with concrete.
Yeah, concrete's literally the rock that we're building these houses on. And you know, it's easy to make concrete look good, but we want to make sure it performs good. And in order to know that, we have to do some quality control testing. And we have some certified inspectors behind us here.
Now, one thing that we're going to test with these certified inspectors is to test how much they know about concrete. Like Luke said, there's so many things that go into it, but let's take a look and see how much they really know.
Yeah. So Tony, what do you got for us?
Okay, Tony and I have been working on this. You keep telling me that there has to be some kind of slope to every concrete driveway. For what reasons?
Yeah, so obviously we want the concrete driveway to slope away from the house towards the street. That way the water sheds away from the house, but we don't want it to do too much. We figure about 3 foot from the curb to the house is the most we want to do, because if we get above that, it gets kind of difficult to walk on, as well as backing trailers on, or even some of those low profile cars have trouble making that adjustment.
Okay, so Tony and I thought 30 foot, you want about a 3 foot slope. Makes sense.
Yep.
Okay.
Now, Tony, are you cleaning our concrete? What are you doing over here?
A little bit of cleaning, but right now I'm really looking at this driveway and I'm looking at the different finishes that we have on here. We have a nice smooth finish here around the perimeter of everything. And in the center of the driveway, we have more of a broomed finish. Has a little bit more texture to it. So if it ever does get wet or anything, it's not going to be quite as slippery. And if you're like shoveling snow, you have a little bit of more grip on there on your feet.
Yeah, and this edge that you talked about, we call that a troweled finish. And the whole reason we do that is because it gives the driveway a nice framed look. It makes it look like it's got an actual edge to it. If we were just to broom this all the way out, it would look a little rough.
Sure.
But we do that broom finish on all of our exterior concrete. Like you said, for when it gets wet, it makes it so people have something to grab onto.
Very nice. Another thing to keep in mind with that broom finish is we always do it in the opposite direction of where foot traffic is going to flow. So if you look at how you're going to walk up your driveway or down your sidewalk, it's always going in a different direction to help your foot really grip that surface.
Yeah, and really finishing concrete is an artwork. You have to know exactly when to broom it, when to trowel it. You can overwork it, you can underwork it. So all of our concrete guys are truly artists.
Now, Kayla, what are you doing?
Well, so I need to see what's in the middle of this, right? I mean, we got to test it. So, I mean, give me a couple hours, and I got a couple holes going, and we'll, yeah, right? That's what I'm supposed to do?
Well, it may take you a couple more hours if you're using that drill, but I see some of the tests that you have here. So with this cylinder test, with what you're holding right there, that's really important, because when we have our concrete suppliers come out, they're always doing quality and control and testing different batches. And they put the date, the set number, the project, the slump test that we'll talk about next, but we're always doing that to just test the overall quality. And they test that at 7 days, 14 days, and 28 days, and then test the structural integrity of it to make sure that it's holding up.
Yeah, and that's what the other one there, yep. Once they test it, and they compress it, it'll break at some sort of PSI, and they'll mark that down. So it might be 4,500 PSI, and this is kind of the leftover remnants of what one of these looks like once it explodes under compression.
Exactly. And then that next cylinder that you're holding there too is what we call a core test. So sometimes if we ever have to test the concrete, we'll actually drill a core to see how the aggregate is spaced out, and that's just letting us know that the mix is actually doing what it's supposed to let us know that we can proceed further with the type of mixes that they're making for us, and it just lets us know some reassurance that the structural integrity, like we talked about, is holding up.
Yep. So this one's pretty even in coating, so that's a good sign, right?
Yep, you can see the large, the small, how the cement's holding it all together. That's a really good sample there.
Yeah. Awesome.
Now, Lonnie, what are you doing over here?
Well, they put me in charge of the slump test. This is a very important test. We've been doing this since I can remember in construction in our area. And basically, we take this thing, kind of looks like a snow cone, doesn't it?
It kind of does.
Makes me hungry. But anyway, we put the concrete into this cone. We're going to fill it all the way to the top. And then we're going to take this cone off, and we're going to measure how much this cone of concrete slumps. And the rule of thumb is if it slumps more than 8 inches, we're in trouble. However, if it slumps less than 2 inches, we're also in trouble. So we're going to test the integrity of the concrete in this cone.
Yeah, and the reason we do that, Lonnie, is because there's no more important ingredient than the water to cement ratio. Basically, 1 gallon per water per 1 cubic yard of concrete will lower that slump 1 slump. So just 1 gallon for 1 cubic, that's all it takes. So just adding a little bit of water decreases the performance of our concrete greatly.
Hey, here comes a concrete truck now. I'm going to go get a sample.
Yeah.
All right.
Elizabeth, what are you working on over here?
Well, I'm out here testing the PSI, the pounds per square inch. This is so important when it comes to concrete, and it's different when it comes to your driveway, your slab. They're all going to test differently.
And you're using a hammer to do that?
Well, yeah, I thought I'd do that. I'll just
Whoa!
Yeah, let's not do that. I think we can save you some time. So this is actually called a Swiss hammer test. So what this does is it tests that PSI, or pounds per square inch. So rather than hitting that mallet 4,500 times, you can use this just in one shot, and it'll give you the reading that you need on your driveway or any other exterior concrete surface.
I think it's important, you said pounds per square inch. We're talking 4,500 pounds per literally square inch that this concrete can withstand.
Exactly.
That's pretty incredible.
It is.
Absolutely.
It is. You know, here's
That's
one square
one
inch.
square inch.
Now, Tony, what are you working on?
You know, you mentioned earlier, when you're working with concrete and cement, it's not just a science, but also an art form. And here in Indiana, when we have so many different seasons, we need to adjust our mixture according to the season. So I'm just looking at some of the different ingredients that we can put into it to actually change it for the weather that we have.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Concrete and weather are two of the biggest concerns, especially when we're starting the house.
Absolutely.
Throughout the rest of the house phase, weather just might delay it, but the weather really affects what kind of concrete we order from the plant. And you can do a lot of different things to make sure that that concrete is going to cure, is going to perform the way that we are specifying.
And that's why it's so great working with the suppliers that we do, because like Tony was saying, it really is an art form, and they have chemists that are looking at the different mixtures, the different additives that we're putting in there to make sure that we've got the right mix.
Well, I think the audience can see this is a very complex subject, a very interesting subject. We're going to proceed and get this show open, and we're all going to be about concrete today. All right, guys, let's get our stuff that we need and just get right back here in about 2 minutes.
He said volcanic ash is the ingredient. Let's go to Hawaii.
You guys go get us.
Let's go.
Let's go check it out.
Welcome to Between the Studs. We are Granite Ridge Builders, custom builders serving northern Indiana, northwest Ohio, and also parts of southern Michigan. We have been building custom homes for almost 2 decades, and we're really passionate about what we do. So join us today as we explore the processes, the trends, and also tips that characterize today's new home. Thanks for watching.
Izzy, this is so interesting. I learned that this is a Swiss hammer. It's a much easier way to test the PSI of concrete.
Nice.
Well, welcome back. I think you're going to find this show very interesting. It's all about concrete. We're going to talk about foundation, and it is one of the most crucial part of a home. So, what else do we want to talk about today?
Well, Tony, I'm going to be talking about something related to the foundation. We're going to be talking about footers, and footers are crucial. I mean, when we think about what holds up a house, what holds up our basement walls, you've got to start with footers. And do you guys know why we call them footers?
Uh-oh, no.
I mean, think about it. Standing here, look at your feet. Our feet hold us up, so the footer of the foundation holds our house up.
That's a good one.
I'm going to talk about what lays on the footer, which is the slab. It has nothing to do with ribs, but it's actually that part of concrete that we put our floor on. It's a very important part.
Yeah, it is.
We're going to talk about slab composition.
Yeah, and I know I mentioned it briefly in the pre, but the weather is so crucial when it comes to pouring the concrete, and it is really an art mixed with a science. It's a lot like baking. There's a lot of chemical reactions that go on in order to get that, cake to rise. But the weather, they're glued to the radar, but it's not just about rain. It can be too hot to pour concrete. It can be too windy. The humidity can be too high, or even the ground temperature can be too low, or there's too much moisture in the ground. So there's a lot of things that could keep us from being able to pour.
The thing that I'm going to be talking about is the unsung hero in a lot of ways. No one talks about it, but it's the flat work. It's the sidewalks. It's the porches. It can be the curbs, because if you're not careful there, I kind of know you can lose a muffler on one of those.
He did.
And I'll get into a little bit more about the basement. Again, it's a great asset to many homes, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how we make that.
And I'm going to talk about floating and screeding. This is really important when it comes to finishing the concrete. It takes a lot of technique and experience to do this.
And what about all those little areas? You have sidewalks and porches and patios and covered verandas, and there's so many components that concrete is in. And I'm not going to say it yet, but there's even one over on over half of our houses today that there's probably not many people out there that know it's made of concrete. So stay tuned and I'll let you know what that is.
Ooh, so stay tuned. This is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to go ahead and start. Guys, first segment.
Let's do it.
So we have the
I've got a
texture.
Swiss Army
Right,
knife.
yeah,
Is that
when-
the same
when is
thing?
that?
Yeah, when are the slabs
Well,
ready,
I mean,
Lonnie?
Tyler, what are you doing exactly?
Well, I'm prepping this lot for footers, but you know what? I don't even know why I'm using this. I mean, we used to use shovels back in the day to dig footers, but technology has advanced so much. I mean, we've got a machine that I think is coming here in about 30 minutes, and I completely forgot about it.
Yeah, and he'll have this whole thing trenched in an hour.
I know. And you know, I am really excited to talk about footers today, because when we talk about building a solid investment and we talk about what anchors your home to the ground, I mean, we have to start with footers, and we have to start with concrete.
Yeah, and it's probably the most important part of concrete, but it gets covered up and nobody even realizes it's there.
That's true. So one of the critical components of doing a solid footer is talking about how we dig into the ground and how deep we dig.
And most of the subdivision lots that you're going to come across, there's already a pad that's been established, and we know that there's good solid dirt underneath there. But when you build up at the lakes or out in the country, we need to verify that the footer that we're putting down onto that ground, that ground can support the weight of the house. So that's step number one. We need to make sure that that subsoil is in good condition.
That's true. And a lot of times when they trench that footer, you know, the region that we live in, when we talk about the frost line, we're always digging at least 36 inches into the ground. And then another thing that I like to do when we go around a foundation and we trench a footer is we call it probing. So we're probing that footer or the bottom of the ground to make sure that it's nice and solid so that we can pass inspection before we have concrete trucks come out.
Yeah, and you mentioned the area that we build in, where you have a lot of clay. So that trencher comes in, and we don't have form boards when we do the footers, unlike we do with the basement. The clay itself, the ground, will hold its form, and we can pour concrete right in it. So really there's only the top that gets exposed to any kind of weather element.
Exactly, and that makes it really easy, you know, when we don't have to build those forms and we just have the ground that we're able to use for the concrete. But another component that we'll also use is insulating that foundation when we're trenching a slab. So we'll use a polystyrene foam that we'll actually put up against the foundation, so that helps hold all of that, that heat in and doesn't allow that cold air transfer to come through, correct?
Correct, and you mentioned that we're going at least 36 inches deep. The trench is actually 14 inches, but we put that foam board in, which is 2, so the footer itself is 12 inches wide, and then after that we can form our slab, and the slab gets tied into that footer by using rebar. So we put rebar every so often, and we just tie it in, so it's called a monolithic pour, which means that the slab ties into the footer, which then transfers the weight into the ground.
Now, with talking about footers, you know, for a slab too, I mean, the same concept applies to our basement walls. So we'll do a footer for a basement wall to help support all that weight, and that wall will actually, when they're setting their forms like we talked about earlier in the show, they'll attach it right to the footer, and that just helps everything stay nice and solid all the way up.
Yep, and as you can see, like I mentioned, footers, they get covered up, but as far as concrete concerns, that is a critical step in the process.
Well, I'm glad that we were able to share with the viewers all this information about footers, but let's get everything prepped and ready for those trucks. I'm so glad I don't have to use that shovel.
Okay, so in this segment, we're going to talk about the slab foundation, which is basically the concrete foundation that you stand on, put your carpet on, put your cabinets on, et cetera, et cetera. And it's tied into the footer that you talked about in the last segment.
That's right, Lenny. And when we're talking about footers and slabs, we're going to talk about 5 critical layers that make up a slab foundation.
Okay, the footer's in the ground, so what is layer number 1 that comes after the footer?
Layer number 1 is always going to be that dirt. So that grade of dirt that we bench off the lot with, that we talked about, you know, when we start breaking ground. Then that next layer is actually going to be the aggregate. Okay. So a lot of times we'll have about 10 to 12 inches of aggregate after they've put the form boards up to make the slab. And then sometimes that aggregate can vary because we're also putting mechanicals under slabs nowadays.
Right, so things like plumbing, things like heating. And again, the aggregate can vary because sometimes we want to bring the elevation up or down a little bit, right?
Correct, and sometimes we have to meet height clearances, you know, for code purposes with mechanicals and certain things that we're putting in the slab.
So the stone is in place. Then with the plumbing and heating have been done, then comes the next layer, which we call the visqueen.
Correct. The visqueen is basically a vapor barrier that we put on top of that stone. And once we've laid the visqueen, we next bring in the steel wire mesh that we roll out on top of the slab. And the steel wire mesh basically acts as like a tensile strength between the concrete to help hold everything together.
And they're pulling that up as they pour the concrete. The idea is to get it someplace in the middle of that 4-inch slab, which is the next layer, right?
Correct. So then at the top of that, then we've got the slab on grade, and we're finishing that out. We're power troweling that finish, and sometimes when we're power troweling that finish and as it's curing, you know, sometimes we run into field occurrences where we may end up seeing some shrinkage cracks at various points in time. But what I always tell people is concrete's very unique. Concrete is literally a living organism, so it's always guaranteed to do two things in its lifetime. It's going to get hard, and at some point there could be some cracks, but those shrinkage cracks are just basically as the concrete's curing and it's getting rid of that bleed water, it's shrinking in and of itself. And a slab that we're standing on right now, after it fully cures, can actually shrink almost a quarter of an inch in size.
And so a little crack you may see is not necessarily a problem at all when it comes to the slab construction, correct?
Correct. Another thing that you may see is something that people call honeycombing.
Oh yeah, yeah. A lot of people are concerned about that. They see that, all those holes on the side of their foundation.
I know. I'll get calls that say, hey, there's voids in the side of my concrete, but it's nothing to be concerned about. It's more of a cosmetic thing. And what causes that is when we're tamping the forms around a slab, sometimes you'll create those voids or pockets.
You pull off the form.
Correct. And that's what gives it that honeycomb appearance. But what we oftentimes do is we come back in and trowel over that with some extra concrete to give it a nice smooth finish. But it's just part of the quality and control checks that our project managers do in the field to make sure that everything looks nice and good.
And segregation is another problem that we see from time to time. So can you explain it?
Sure. So what I'm holding in my hand are ingredients right now. And so what Lonnie's talking about when it comes to segregation is just how the uniformity of those ingredients in the concrete look. So that's part of what the truck is doing when it's bringing the mixture out to the job site, but also as we're screeding the concrete and then finishing it out, we're wanting to make sure that we're not finishing it too much to make sure that everything has a nice uniform appearance inside the slab.
You can see this is a very technical subject. We take it very serious. Come on into Granite Ridge. We'll talk to you about your slab and the home we're going to set on it.
All right, is that enough fill, you think?
I think that's the appropriate amount of stone.
All right.
Izzy, I'm thoroughly impressed that you dug this whole thing with just that shovel.
Hey, it's on a day's work, you know.
I'm not that impressed. His wife told me he's really good at digging holes.
Well, we do have a concrete basement behind us here, so what we want to do is talk a little bit about how did we get to this point, though?
Yeah, so the excavator showed up, dug the hole in one day. Typically, we dig that hole 3 foot wider in every direction than the footprint of the house. So that way there's plenty of room to get the forms in there and get the stone around, get the perimeter tiles. But once he digs the hole, then the concrete guys show up. They form the footers. The footers are 16-inch wide by 8 inches deep. They get that all the little offsets of the house set. Then once the footer is cured, then they'll come in and they'll do the walls. So they get these big forms and they take them down that hole and they'll literally form every wall up. You can kind of see the lines. That's where they transition from one form to the other. And those are 9-foot forms, so 9-foot formed wall heights. And typically it's about 8 inches thick.
So we've got 8 inches here. Would you ever do more than 8 inches?
Yeah, we do 10 occasionally. So if that wall is a straight wall and it's maybe more than 40 foot, we'll beef it up to 10 inches just to add a little bit more support to that wall.
Okay. And again, a basement is a hole in the ground, and so water can always be a problem for it. What do we do to prevent water penetration for the basement?
Well, we take a lot of steps, Izzy, in terms of water prevention, you know, around a basement foundation, and it all starts with those perimeter tiles. So as Luke was talking, we'll put a perimeter tile that ties all around the foundation of the home and ties into the sump pit, and then on top of that, we'll put another layer of stone, and that just helps a lot of that groundwater to force itself to the pit, and then we can pump it out through the sump pump out the back of the house. But then another thing that we do, as you can see, this black coloring on these basement walls, is we add a layer of damp proofing, and that's basically a tar membrane that helps prevent that bleed water from like leaching through the concrete to the interior of your home.
So it's all about the least path of resistance for the water getting it away from the house itself, especially from the basement.
That's right.
Now, we've got more than one type of basement that we could do here too, though. What other types of basement can we have?
Well, there's different types of basements. As you can see here, this is more of a daylight basement with an egress window in the back, and we'll put a Rockwell window well out back, and then with that being a bedroom, that allows people to escape through that basement window in the event there was ever a fire or an emergency. But we also do just regular daylight basements with just some various windows that maybe not are in a bedroom, and we can also do walkout basements. So depending on the pitch or the lay of the land, you can really feather that out and allow all this area for you to walk out the back of your home, and it creates a nice setting. But it really just depends on kind of what you're looking for and what lot you're building on.
So there's lots of options for basements, and again, concrete is a huge component in these basements. And you learned a little bit today about how we do it, why we do it, and why it does it so well.
With Granite Ridge Builders, one of our main focuses on everything is going to be the concrete of the home, the foundation of the home, but that also includes all of the flat work in the home. And Luke, why don't we talk a little bit about what flat work is in general?
Yeah, so flat work is essentially the concrete that you can walk up across. So like a basement wall, you're not going to walk across, but driveways, your slabs, your porches, your sidewalks, all that's considered flat work.
Now they also consider the curbs flat work as well, correct?
Yep, and you can see behind us we have what's called a rolled curb. That's pretty traditional around our Allen County area, but sometimes there's a square curb, and we have to cut those square curbs out before we can pour our driveway, because obviously you can't transition a car up that square curb.
And as we talked earlier, I happen to know that firsthand, losing a muffler one time, and we did a curb cut now. Now a curb cut is when they're going to cut that center part of it out, so if you do have a smaller clearance car, something along those lines, you can get that done for about $1,200 to $1,500.
Yeah, it's a really nice feature.
So really the next big part of this is the driveway itself. Now when we're putting together the driveway, is there anything different with that than some of the other parts of the home?
Yeah, well, let's just start from the top and work our way down. So most of the driveway is going to be about 4 inches thick. But down by the curb, that actually goes down to 6 inches.
Okay.
Then once we get below that 4 inches of concrete, we get into a bed of stone down there, so a couple inches of stone, and there's no footer under a driveway like our slab. That's going to have the opportunity to free float as the weather changes. So you'll notice that there are times where maybe that transition from the curb may be a little bit more pronounced in the wintertime versus the summer. And then one thing I forgot to mention, in that 4 inches of concrete is still the wire mesh. So that helps hold it all together.
Okay, and then really the next step is this right here, isn't it?
Yeah, so when they're finishing the concrete trucks come out, they pour the concrete inside those forms, then they take a 2x4 or a long straight edge and they'll do what's called screeding. And Izzy and I did this, we took our hand at it and we thought we did pretty good. But what they do is they're basically making sure that there's the right amount of concrete in this area and it's following that slope as it works its way down. So, and you know, if they run across an area and needs a little bit more concrete, they'll place some in there. So screeding's getting it about 90% of the way there.
Now, when they're going to the next step of that though, they're doing something called bull floating or floating.
So essentially, Tony, what the bull floating is it's a long trowel that you can change the pitch of the angle on, which is connected to a 20 to 30 foot pole, and you just twist that to change that angle. You're just working the surface back and forth. You'll see people just pulling that pole ever so slowly, and that does 3 things. Okay. One, it's pushing the big aggregate towards the bottom and just bringing a very thin layer of cream towards the top, making it so you can work the concrete, give it that nice finish. 2, it works that water to make sure it's evaporating, and then the other thing it does is it helps just compact that concrete to make sure there's no big voids.
So we've got the trowel, we've got the bull float. Now when you're doing the bull float, how is that different between a driveway and let's say the slab of a house?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when they're working the slab of a house, you'll see a lot of guys on the other end of a power trowel, and they're just sitting there working that surface, which gives it a nice, smooth, almost like a glossy finish. You notice on our driveways, we don't have that. We don't want to do that. One of the things is because we put air in our driveway mixes. Essentially what that is all those thousands of tiny little bubbles is in this surface, and we want those spaces because concrete is very porous. Okay. And in the winter time, you get water in it and it freezes. It gives that water that's freezing a place to go so it doesn't do any damage to the concrete itself. And then in the first 24 hours, we need to make sure we cut that driveway. So what we're doing is we're coming in with a saw and literally cutting joints in it to make sure that we're trying to encourage it to crack in those areas. Right. And then the last step is we seal it. And one Granite Ridge difference is we're using an upgraded sealer, and the sealer protects it from salt, protects it from those harsh winters, and we use an upgraded sealer, which means that it's going to be in there and it penetrates in the first half inch. You don't need to reseal for another 5 to 7 years. Right. A typical sealer you're supposed to do every year, and it wears off very quickly.
Big thing with this is when it comes to flat work and concrete, there's a lot of different components on it. Make sure you check out our YouTube page with Granite Ridge Builders and check out some of the videos that we have that talk all about these tips.
So we're going to talk about some of the fine details of concrete, and it's the sidewalks and patios, porches. We're doing so many covered verandas, outdoor living areas, and what I bet you didn't know is a lot of the stone fireplaces and porch pedestals and all the stone on the front of the house that we're using today is manufactured stone, and that is made of concrete. So we don't have concrete just on what we're walking on and what the basement walls are made out of, but that is on the front of your house as well.
Now, Kayla, we're out here on this veranda, and the covered portion of this veranda, the concrete is on a footer, and that is because this is attached to the house.
Right, you can see, there's posts coming down on this concrete, so there's structural components to it. So again, we need to tie that back down to the ground, which means we need a footer in it. But the patio portion of this, no footer, it's free to float.
Now, this patio could be on a footer. If we were going to do, we have a little step here. If we wanted to do it one level, then we would put a footer on this patio.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Or if a homeowner wanted to put a hot tub or something large on it, we put it on a footer to keep it from moving.
Now, what do we do with our front porches, and how are those supported by, we have a lot of posts sitting on them a lot of times, so what do we do with those?
Yeah, again, front porches, no different than the back porches, would have those footers because of those posts coming down on it, and it's all part of that roof structure. So if you see those posts, you see the roof overhanging, chances are there's a footer underneath there.
And a lot of these surfaces are broom finish, like the driveway, correct?
Yeah, any of the exterior concrete, anything that has a chance to get wet. So even in screened-in porches, we're going to broom finish, because if anybody stepped on shroud, which is that nice glossy finish, stepped on that with wet feet, it's like on an ice rink. You'll just slip right out. So that broom finish is crucial to have on that exterior concrete.
Now, a lot of these places that we've been talking about, the patios, sidewalks, front porches, now we're seeing a lot of people doing some upgraded features to these, right, Elizabeth?
We sure are. We're doing stamped different finishes on top of these. Of course, we're in a subdivision, so we do have our sidewalks along the street. Those are typically 5 feet wide. So there's a lot of concrete when it comes to your property. So now, Luke, we've talked so much about concrete, but can you remind us once again, what is the formula for the concrete?
Yeah, so a third of it is going to be that coarse aggregate, the larger rock. Another third is going to be what's called fine aggregate, or the sand. There's 15% water, typically, then there's 10% of cement, and then there's 10 to 15% of other chemicals. And one of the Granite Ridge differences that we do on our sidewalks, on our driveways, on our porches and patios, is we add slag into that mix. And what that does is it provides a nice, white, clean looking concrete. It kind of takes some of that gray element out of it.
We have so many verandas right now on our spec homes and our build jobs. Please come visit us on a Sunday. We would love to sit out on a veranda and talk about your next home.
Well, it's a nice day. Why don't we sit on the veranda?
All right, I'm good with that.
Lonnie, I am so glad that we were able to show our viewers at home about a slump test.
Yes,
You know, when we're talking about a slump test in concrete, the word of the day is workability.
Right, I've heard that for 40 years. The guys want to know, how workable is this concrete going to be?
That's right. So
Yes.
just like with concrete and a slump test, I mean, it's kind of like baking something. You know, when you have batter, you don't want it to be too dry or too wet. You want that mix to be just
Right
right.
in the middle, right.
And that's what makes it easy for our concrete trade partners to lay it down.
Yeah, Tyler, it all comes down to the formula, and we work closely with IMI to make sure that our formula is dialed in to make sure we have the best performing concrete. And we can do a lot of things, put a lot of admixtures into our concrete to improve the workability, maybe, you know, offset what the weather's doing. And, you know, I have slag in my hand here. What do you guys all have?
Well, I have limestone.
Some chemicals.
I've got air and a water reducer.
Sand.
Cement and water.
As you guys can see, there's a lot, and this is just a few examples. There's even more at the batch where they're putting it all together, so it can be very complicated.
I hope you enjoyed the show. It's fun making this, and we love the education part. If you have any questions, obviously call us, but Kayla, would you go ahead and close?
You know, thank you guys so much for spending part of your day with us. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about who we are, what we do, and why we do what we do so well, please pick up the phone and give us a call, visit our website, or even better yet, come in our front door. We'd love to talk to you about this important subject of concrete and how it relates to your new home.
I thought this was great. I
awesome,
love
guys.
that.
Sand.
Oh my gosh.
We need more sand.
So who wants to do a slump test?
So if we get more sand,
Yeah, let's get one
and
done.
we get some volcanic ash, we can go back to
volcanic ash.
Hawaii.
I've got air and water reducer.
Sand.
Limestone.
Cement.
I got it stuck in my head.
Cement and
Oh,
water.
I have cement and water.
Start over from here now.
Or is it even has a label?
I know. I was saying, I keep on thinking that stupid label.
There's
I was-
somebody,
I was like, hold
there's
now.
something biting us.
Yeah.
It hurts.
Okay. I was thinking, come on.